It's wonderful to welcome James Kierstead to the program. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. He now serves as a research fellow at the New Zealand Initiative. So that means that he's based in New Zealand. Uh, he wrote an article that was published in Quillette a few months ago. It's titled Monogamy and the Making of Western Civilization. James, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Nice to be on your show.
It's nice having you here. So it's also my first time interviewing someone who's from New Zealand. First, tell me about New Zealand in relations to the civilization of the West.
Oh, that's a big question. Well, I would say that it's actually potentially a controversial question as well, because I think that nowadays a lot of what you would call the establishment is very keen to stress the Polynesian part of New Zealand civilization, of New Zealand. And that is an important part of New Zealand heritage. There's no doubt about it. There's something like 15 to 20% of New Zealanders who are Maori by heritage, so they're native New Zealanders. And maybe there's another 5-ish% who are from the Pacific Islands. So those two things are important. Those two groups of people are important, and the Polynesian heritage is important. But I think it's pretty obvious to most visitors to New Zealand that there's also a Western heritage, and that's actually dominant, and it's really mostly what's behind the way that New Zealand society is today. And you can see that in things like the sports that we play. We play rugby and cricket like the Brits. Also to our political arrangements. There's a parliament, to our legal system. So we have uh, common law legal system. So in all those ways, you can see the inheritance of the West, and also I should say religion is an important thing. I mean, it's declining in New Zealand by some standards. New Zealand is one of the world's most secular societies, but it's obvious that Christianity was for a long time the dominant religion, and it's still the single largest religion. So in all those ways, I think we should speak of it as a Western country. It's just as I say, within universities nowadays, it's really not something that you want to stress because you might get in trouble. It's not the PC thing to talk about.
I see. Yeah, it's I'm guessing it's roughly the same as in Canada. I was there for 4 years. Ultimately a Western Anglo country and was populated by natives before the arrival of Europeans. And there's a movement to basically repudiate the Western heritage and underscore or emphasize the indigenous heritage.
Yeah, no, I'm actually, well, I was going to say I'm a native Canadian. I'm not a native Canadian in the sense, in the indigenous sense, but I was
Is
born
it?
in Canada and
Okay.
I lived in Canada for the first 7 or 8 years of my life. And my dad was in the Canadian Army, so I grew up on Canadian Army bases around the world. And I definitely, even though I've been outside of Canada for a long time, I have relatives that are still in Canada tell me about it. And yeah, my impression is that Canada is very similar to New Zealand in a lot of ways. And this is one of those ways too, that you have this very sort of Protestant mindset. And with that comes quite a strong guilt complex. And I think that applies to our history as well. And of course, there were things that the colonialists did in Britain, in New Zealand, and in Canada that were indefensible. So we have to acknowledge those things as part of history. But in some ways, the country's history is similar to other countries. People settle other countries, they invade them, things happen, and in Canada, there's this big effort now to stress the indigenous part of Canadian culture, and really, as you say, to downplay the British aspect. Of course, when I was a kid in Canada, so this is going back pretty far now, like to the 90s, the real debate and the real cultural fault line was between French Canadians and English Canadians, or Francophones and Anglophones. And I left Canada. I stopped living in Canada for the last time in 1993, which was when they had the last referendum on Quebec independence. So that was the thing people were always talking about. And in some ways, the Maori stuff in New Zealand is similar to the old debate about the position of French in Canada, because Maori, as I said, was something like 50 to 20% of the population. And traditionally in Canada, I guess it's more like a quarter, but now I think it's down a bit, right? Probably only 20% French-speaking population of Canada at this point. So you have similar size populations, although with interesting differences. Like I think the Maori revitalization project, the project to revitalize the Maori language, it faces much more difficulties than the project of making Canada officially bilingual. I mean, even the project of making Canada officially bilingual is a very surface thing, as you know. It really only applies to sort of government workers. But at least in Canada, French is a global language. You can easily access it. There are movies and books and songs in French. Maori, of course, there are songs and books, but I mean, very few people speak Maori, and even people of Maori ethnicity in New Zealand tend not to speak Maori anymore. So yeah, anyway, there are lots of similarities, and one of them is definitely that both Canada and New Zealand at this point, among the cultural elite, there's this effort to kind of move away from what are historically our British roots, our roots in the British Isles.
Mhm. Okay, so that brings us to the New Zealand initiative. What is it, and what is your role in it?
Okay, well, the New Zealand Initiative is a think tank. It focuses on public policy. So we actually work mainly on economic policy. Most of my colleagues are economists, although we also have a very influential work stream in education. And my close colleague and friend Michael Johnson heads that up, and he works mainly on schools. Um, and I work on universities. I work mainly on universities, I should say. One of the delights of working in a place like this is that I sometimes get the opportunity also to comment on things like uh, trade with China or democracy or New Zealand's electoral system, things like that. So I occasionally dabble in other things, but my main job description is to try and reform New Zealand's universities, and that's plenty to get on with.
Mhm. And is the repudiation of monogamous culture part of these things that you find that needs reforming?
I should say that the repudiation of monogamous culture is not part of the official positions of the New Zealand Initiative. Um, no, I mean, I wrote that article mainly just to explore the topic because I've observed this in my own life that more people are saying I'm poly. You know, it's part of, it really is part of elite culture, part of university culture. I think less so among sort of more ordinary folks. But even, you know, in a country like New Zealand, a lot of people are exploring with these different things. And I just recently read Joseph Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, about people from weird countries, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that has a lot about monogamy and monogamy's influence on the West. And so I thought I'd write a little think piece about that. And yeah, it's funny. I think that the piece, it's funny that you say, you asked me as part of your project to repudiate monogamy, because my sense is that with the Quillette article, like with the comments and the comments under the YouTube video that Quillette made of it, a lot of people interpreted that as like a conservative article against polygamy or polyamory. And what my concern when writing the article was actually neither. It wasn't really to say we have to keep being monogamous or we have to all be polyamorous. It's more sort of, oh, this is an interesting thing. I can understand why people might be into that. I can understand why liberal values might make that possible. And I like liberal values. But I also have some concerns. You know, that all this recent work that's been done on the value of monogamy in Western history suggests that, you know, we might not want to be too precipitous in throwing this practice out or weakening it.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm pretty pro monogamy myself. My reading of polygamy, at least in the history of my home country, which is Vietnam, is that it is practiced by people who have, royalty and power, and they are often not the best rulers. So, kings have wives and concubines and such. Um, but it was never available to the common people because simply they cannot afford it. Um, so
Yeah,
tell
that's
me,
the way these things tend to go.
yeah,
It's usually elite polygyny, right? So
yeah,
polyamory or polygamy in historical practice tends to be rich, powerful men having multiple female partners. We're talking about polygamy, we're talking about marriage, so they have multiple wives in a lot of societies outside of the West. Or they have, you know, and or they have multiple wives and they have harems or concubines. And obviously, if you do the math, I mean, it tends to be more or less equal number of women and men. If the elite guys have these huge harems, or even if they have like multiple wives, it leaves fewer women for the guys lower down the pecking order. And you know, in historical practice, it was easier for sort of powerful men just to kind of get the just to really almost literally kind of possess the woman.
yeah,
And there's also this fact that the women seem to have this hypergamous sexuality that they actually look to the more powerful men anyway. So that makes things very difficult for the guys lower down the pecking order.
of course. So, from your observation, what makes polygamy so attractive amongst a certain section of the Western population?
Well, in a way, I think it's obvious. Like, I think the answer is, well, you know, what Christians used to call lust, you know, or what maybe in more liberal enlightened times we would just call desire. People have sexual desire, mostly heterosexual, and women. Oh, well, let's start with men because that's easier. I mean, men seem to be naturally quite polygynous. They ask men on surveys how many sexual partners would you like over the course of your lifetime, and I can't remember what the answers are, but they're higher than women. They say like 20 or 30, and the women say 7 or 8. So, men have a tendency in that direction, and always have. Women also have a tendency to want to seek out, more powerful men. Men have been covert affairs. If people can do that in a way which remains kind of honest and they're not lying to their partner, then that seems like, a win-win for a lot of people. And that's why I am actually kind of sympathetic to this view. And I put it in the article, from a liberal perspective, if I want to, kind of contract or agree to have three girlfriends or, my girlfriend wants to have two boyfriends, then there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that, right? And this is the way that Western society has been going. And in general, I think it's a good thing that we think that people are free to make contracts of that sort with each other as long as they're consenting adults. So that's kind of the positive case, I suppose, for polyamory.
Yeah, well, that's fair. Um, so why is it the case that historically polygyny, so one man having multiple female partners, is more common than polyandry, which is one woman having multiple male partners?
Yeah, so that is a very pronounced and consistent bias. And if you look in the Ethnographic Atlas, which has a whole database of human societies, there are there's this huge skew. There are lots and lots of polygynous societies, and there are very, very few polyandrous societies in the human record. And why is that? I think we have to go into evolutionary psychology and the nature of human reproduction, basically. So if you're a powerful man and you have multiple women, basically, you know whose children everybody is. I mean, as long as you make sure that nobody else is getting access to your women. Um, with the other way around, I guess it gets a bit more difficult. If there's one woman and there's three or four boyfriends, the baby comes out of the woman. Who's the father? So that's one of the dynamics. But as you say, I think that, you were talking before power. That's often the way it goes. That because powerful men, by definition, have been powerful. They've been able to just get huge numbers of women, and also women have this hypergamous tendency. They look to the more powerful men, and the other way around, it just doesn't quite work the same. The sexual jealousy is also a big thing. I mean, women have some jealousy to some extent too. It's an argument that doesn't tend to be so sexual in nature. It tends to be more relational. Women tend to be more jealous of if their partner is interested emotionally in another woman, whereas men tend to focus on the sexual act. So all these things I think make it more difficult, or just more unlikely that you're going to have these relationships with multiple men and one woman rather than one man and multiple women. It does happen, and I think it happens in polyamorous liaisons now. But I haven't seen any good data on like what do modern elite polyamorous relationships tend to look like. But I would expect that it also has this bias of it tends to be one guy with multiple women rather than one woman with multiple guys, just because of human nature.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm reminded of this classic Chinese movie, Race of Red Lantern, with Gong Li, and she plays the one of the concubines of a prominent warlord, and then I believe she was involved in like this hierarchy competition with the other wives and concubines of the same warlord, and so
Yeah,
the
that's a great movie. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So
No, it's keep going.
yeah, you mentioned the degree of jealousy amongst like women when competing for male partners, and that was very pronounced in that movie.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, I was trying to say that female jealousy tends to be more relational. I mean, you could argue that in that film as well. I mean, as I recall, like the name of the movie, The Red Lantern, is from the practice that this big guy had. What was he? Some kind of warlord? Yeah, this warlord had of like putting a red lantern outside of the room of the wife that he was sleeping with that night. Was that the idea? And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
the
I believe
others
so.
would then get jealous, and there were all these kind of alliances and
Yep.
betrayals. And I can't remember what happens in the end, but it's extremely kind of unhappy picture, right? So I'm sure women experience sexual jealousy too, but you could argue in that situation that what they're really after is the attention of the man and the resources of the man. That tends to be quite a big thing in these situations. And of course, if you look throughout human history at royal weddings and royal marriages, what becomes very fraught in these polygamous relationships with kings is also whose children get to succeed to the throne. And there are even, murders. Mother of one child murders the child of another wife because she doesn't want him to inherit the throne in the kingdom. So yeah, this is really terrible scenarios psychologically, but they played out in hundreds of royal families in the course of human history.
So, what makes monogamy unique?
Well, what makes Western monogamy unique is really the intensity of it, and I think that one of the elements of this intensity is the idea that men shouldn't sleep around, which nowadays just or if men sleep around, they should let the woman sleep around as well. But traditionally, it's men shouldn't sleep around in traditional Western monogamy, and I mean that seems just kind of fair to us at this point, I think, in Western culture, or it did when I was growing up. But from most of human history, that wasn't the deal. And even if you look at Greece and Rome, which were actually monogamous to some extent, the norm in classical Athens, for example, is the historical society that I know best. The norm is that the woman has to be monogamous, monoandrous. She only can sleep with one man, who's her husband, and the man can do a lot of things. And there's this notorious passage in Demosthenes where he says to the jurors of Athens, who are presumably kind of nodding when he's saying this, he says, we have three different types of prostitutes in Athens, sex workers. There are different Greek names for them. But basically, he says, like, some of them, I can't remember the passage perfectly, but some of them help us for the care of our bodies. Some of them are just for fun. And some of them are kind of for civilized enjoyment, right? And there are different kinds of prostitutes. Kind of like in Japan, there are different kinds of prostitutes who, go to varying levels of involvement. But so men in Athens can do that. They have these different types of prostitutes. They have a wife usually, and in Athens as well, and in classical Greece, there's this originally kind of aristocratic, and then later on something that spread to the rest of the population, or a lot of the rest of the population. There was this practice of pederasty. Pederasty is a relationship between an older man and a younger man slash boy, quite young, early teens. Um, that's the sort of ideal that we see in the Greek text. So male citizens in Athens were having sex with a whole bunch of different people and their wives, and that was normal, and that wasn't frowned upon at all, really. And so that changed really with Christianity. Okay, the second thing that's distinctive about Western monogamy is that it's, well, one technical term for it is socially imposed universal monogamy. That's what Walter Scheidel and others call it. And the universal aspect there really means universal across the social hierarchy, all the way up the social hierarchy. And that's really the distinctive thing about Western monogamy from the beginning, from its origins, I would argue, in ancient Greece, that it applies to elite males as well. So the norm is very strong that it doesn't matter who you are, you can only have one wife at a time. You can have multiple wives in succession, but if you have multiple wives at once, then you're either a tyrant or you're a barbarian, in which both of which things are bad in the classical Greek worldview, or you may even be both. So Philip of Macedon, who was trying to kind of become a Greek for most of his life, be considered a Greek, he had multiple wives, and that was seen as kind of one of the things that meant that the proper classical Greeks didn't really fully accept him as a Hellene. The other examples that we have of Greeks who had multiple wives are Hellenistic kings and warlords who come after Alexander the Great, who was obviously the son of Philip of Macedon, and also Sicilian tyrants. So Sicily was an area of the greater Greek world where tyranny, so one man rule, lasted longer than in mainland Greece. And some of the tyrants there, especially in Syracuse, they also had multiple wives. So yeah, so I argued in my article, I was really just pushing this argument that I think Walter Scheidel has sort of hinted at. He's a Romanist. I think he thinks really it's more about Rome, but I think it's about classical Athens because that's what I did my PhD on. But no, I think that it really goes hand in hand with the strongly egalitarian and democratic culture of classical Athens. And I go in the article into some evidence that this early Athenian lawgiver Solon may actually have been thinking about monogamy as a form of egalitarianism as well. So I think the Athenians were thinking, you know, and if you look at their political processes, they're obsessed with equality. They're obsessed with giving every citizen, every male citizen, the same chance. And so I think an aspect of that was we need to have the same sexual chances too. And there's a fascinating fragment of an Athenian comic poet where he says that Solon actually set up democratic, described as democratic brothels, public brothels paid for by taxation. I don't know if there's any archaeological evidence for that, but or if it's just a joke. But it's the kind of thing, obviously, that Athenians would have thought, well, it's kind of semi-plausible that Solon would have done that. So I think that they were thinking of monogamy as a way of basically distributing the good of sex.
Mhm. Yeah. I don't know to what extent you know about the Mormons, but they're the ones who, at least for a time, tries to revive the practice of polygamy in the Western world, right in the heart of America. And they would justify that by saying that, oh, there are multiple prophets and kings in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, who had multiple partners. Think Solomon. So what is the Christian response to this, from your observation,
To Mormonism.
to the idea that there's polygamy in the Old Testament, basically.
Well, it's very interesting because actually, in Henrik's book, he kind of traces the tightening of various marital norms through the centuries by the Western Catholic Church. I mean, it wasn't quite the Catholic Church yet because Protestantism hadn't happened. But he's interested mostly in bans on cousin marriage, bans on cousins to various degrees. But I think they also tighten norms around monogamy as well. So, but the point is that that's actually kind of a later Christian thing. Um, and as you say, there are passages. I mean, it's not obvious maybe in the Bible, but there are passages here and there where, as you say, various kind of patriarchs, especially in the Old Testament, have multiple wives. And as far as I can tell, there's no passage in the New Testament where it's clear that Jesus is saying you can only have one spouse. Now, there's lots of stuff about you have to be, you can't covet. So that in the Ten Commandments, go back to the Old Testament, it says, of course, you can't covet your neighbor's spouse, or his ass, of course. Interesting translation. um, but that's consistent with polygamy. Most people, I think, if you grow up going to church like I did, you hear that, and the priests or the minister is saying to you, it means monogamy, and everyone, your parents and everyone that you know is monogamous. You think that that means you have to be faithful to one spouse, but actually, there's no reason to believe that it meant that. It really means however many spouses you have and however many spouses your neighbor has, don't covet your neighbor's wife. It doesn't matter if it's wife number 7 or wife number 1, right? So it's consistent with polygamy. And here again, notice, by the way, we're talking about polygyny. That's the way these things tend to go also in the Bible. I don't know if there's any cases in the Bible of polyandry. But yeah, so it's kind of an interesting thing. And I think that the way that Christianity's grown up, like mainstream Christianity, the mainline Protestant churches, Catholicism, Orthodox Christianity, they've gradually kind of tightened these norms over time so that, in the modern period, the insistence has been on, one man and one woman in marriage. But it wasn't always the case. And Mormonism is interesting because it's obviously a little bit marginal in terms of, well, very marginal, I would say, in terms of Christianity. Like it's one of these sects, and Islam has equivalents too, where most mainstream Christians are kind of puzzled about whether that's even a Christian church, right? Because there's the whole second, they have their own book, the Book of Mormon, and Jesus apparently came to the States. I can't remember all the details, but so it's a function of the sort of marginality of Mormonism within Christianity that parts of Mormonism, not all Mormons, but parts of Mormonism even practice polygyny.
Oh, yeah. I think it's well, I've sort of studied the religion of Mormonism enough, and I've interviewed some Mormon scholars in this very show. Well, I know enough that they don't practice it anymore, but they do believe in it in a sort of a heavenly celestial sense. So just to
That's
have,
interesting. Yeah, I get the impression I've listened to a few people. I didn't, that's not a very different part of North America to Eastern Canada that I grew up on, but I have occasionally come across sort of Mormon intellectual or like people online. I read their articles that that's interesting. Turns out they're from Utah. They have a Mormon heritage and Mormon past. As you say, they've usually kind of come away from it, but I get the sense they have a very strong identity as Mormons. Like I think it must affect you quite profoundly, and I think that even once you leave the church, people still tend to identify as Mormons in the way that a lot of Jews or Catholics do. So that's interesting. It's obviously an interesting religion. Obviously, there's a lot of smart people in Utah, so I'm not sort of down on Mormonism completely, but yeah, I think within Christianity, it can be seen as sort of a marginal sect.
Certainly. Yeah. So to what extent is the development of monogamy culturally enforced in ancient Greece? To what extent was it a gradual development, or whether it was like a response to a sort of economic or social necessity?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I haven't really gone into that last option. I mean, so it may be. So one of the things I said already is that it's associated with this very strong political egalitarianism in classical Athens, which was a sort of radical democracy among the citizens. Ancient Greece in general was also more politically moderate. Now, it's also the case that ancient Greece seems to have been more economically egalitarian than other ancient societies. Certainly, if you compare the civilizations to the east of it or to the south, so like Egypt, the ancient Near East, Achaemenid Persia, societies like that. Also, it seems to be more economically egalitarian than the Bronze Age civilizations of Greece, so the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, who are in many ways much more similar to the Bronze Age civilizations of the Near East. And I'm just reading Victor Davis Hanson's book about the Greek farmers, and he talks a lot about, the model is, or his ideal, which has some support in the evidence, is that these guys, so many of them were these citizen farmers. They had sort of small plots of land. Of course, we know some Greeks had big plots of land, but like a lot of them had these small plots of land. They're very independent minded, and they see each other as equals. And so I don't know if it's economic necessity, but I think the monogamy thing is very much part of that culture of these these citizen males who see themselves as really kind of joint stakeholders in what they call the polis, the city state, in a way that would have been very foreign to most inhabitants of the Near East at the same time. For whom there really is this sort of god, emperor, king at the top of society who maybe has a lot of, well, definitely has access to a lot of women. And in Athens, it's more, I'm a citizen. I'm just as good as any other citizen. I'm obviously much better than slaves. I'm a Greek. I'm much better than barbarians. But in the set of free male citizens, we're all pretty much equal. And I'm not going to let anyone get on top of me. We have rules for that. Whether it's a democratic city state or it's an oligarchic city state, we have rules to make sure that one man doesn't get on top. And so with that mentality, I think comes the idea that why are you so special that you get two wives? That's not right. Weird, kind of weirdly for us because at the same time, they're going to these symposia, these drinking parties, and if we can believe literary depictions and the depictions on vases, they're having a lot of they're having a merry old time with the flute girls maybe the flute girls having less of a merry old time, but and the young guys and all, as I said, there's very rich possible sexual opportunities in Athens for citizen males. But yeah, apparently when it came to wives, one each was the rule, and that's partly because maybe something we haven't brought up yet, but the real distinction between marriage and just sex, so when we're talking about monogamy rather than monogamy or whatever, is that marriage is linked to the production of legitimate children, and that makes it linked to inheritance as well. So that again brings us back to this. There's a link there as well with the economy.
Yeah, certainly. And yeah, Hansen is a brilliant scholar of classical antiquity and military history. So, what's the title of the book that you're reading?
Oh, that's the other Greeks. Yeah, I actually just interviewed Victor for my Ancient Modern podcast,
Hmm.
and that was extremely interesting. Yeah, and I've been following him for many years, and I did my PhD at Stanford, and he did his PhD at Stanford, and I remember he was at the Hoover Institution, and he came into one of my classes when I was a grad student and talked to us a little bit. I think unfortunately, he's one of these figures who's more conservative, and I think he feels a little bit pushed out by the academy. But and in some ways, I think a lot of contemporary scholars of ancient Greek warfare would say his work has been surpassed. But he certainly was a very influential proponent of a certain view of hoplite warfare, which is by no means all wrong. I mean, I think he got most of it right. And he's been influential in other ways too. And he's definitely the kind of scholar who has a real knack for public, connecting with the public. And I think it's kind of a shame that the classics establishment hasn't managed to sort of keep him in the field and in a sort of central role. But there you go.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned your podcast briefly there, so tell me more about that.
Oh, I do a couple podcasts actually. I mean, that's ancient and modern. So that's actually one where I try to explore topics like monogamy, ancient and modern. Really, the idea is just, there was this old hymn book in England. I think this is where the phrase comes from, hymns, ancient and modern. And then within classics, you sometimes run across these edited volumes or books called things like Democracy, Ancient and Modern. So that's Moses Finley, the great American, then Cambridge ancient historian. And so I just sort of had this idea of like, well, you can just kind of take a subject and see how it's treated in the ancient and modern world. So I try and interview people whose work kind of reflects a link of that nature. Mostly because I did my dissertation on Athenian democracy. It's been about Athenian democracy and ancient Greek democracy and how that's different or similar to modern democracy. So I've talked to like Josh Ober, who's my own advisor on Athenian democracy. Paul Cartledge wrote a book about ancient Greek democracy and modern democracy. I talked recently to Hugh Pope, whose father, Morris Pope, was a classical scholar who published a book on direct democracy and citizens' assemblies on the model of ancient Greek democracy. So there's a lot of that. And then recently I did Victor, and that was great. So he, range of topics. He can talk about ancient modern warfare, ancient modern politics, ancient modern agriculture, but also actually Walter Scheidel, who his article called a Peculiar Institution on question mark on Western monogamy and its roots in the ancient world. That was one of my main inspirations for writing that Quillette article. So he obviously also is someone who has a lot of interesting things to say about various topics, ancient and modern. But yeah, so there's that one, and then I do there was another podcast called Free Kiwis. I do with my colleague here, Michael, that I mentioned before, and that's on free speech issues. So yeah, I'm a busy guy. I actually don't get to do as much podcasting as I would like, but I'm trying to follow your lead, doing more podcasts.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm actually because of other commitments, I'm sort of slowing down on this show, although however much I enjoy doing it. Okay. So do you find that culturally it is monogamy is a practice that has an aim of restraining, I guess, male desire at the expense, at the benefit of, say, women in general?
Yeah, that's a big question. Only briefly touched on that in the article. So I think the traditional Christian argument and the world I grew up in, and I'm still sort of in, I think the world I grew up in was more Christian, and now it's become kind of post-Christian, but people still retain a lot of the mores, and now that's kind of breaking down. And I think in that world, it would have been seen as very disrespectful to women, especially to your main female partner, to have sex with other people. It would have been seen as a very cruel thing to do. And so I think the argument there is yes, like women get treated better in monogamous relationships. Um, but then again, there's a whole sort of countervailing view that's emerged in the West since the 60s um, around polyamory that makes a different argument. So I'm thinking of books like The Ethical Slut. That's a classic influential book in this mode, and it used to be associated with kind of people in San Francisco. They're a little bit marginal in the past, but now I really think very rapidly that view has come to kind of maybe not dominate the sort of higher echelons of Western society, but it's become very influential in kind of universities. And in that view, it's more like, jealousy is something that you can handle, and women, some strands of feminism actually play into this. The idea is women should have the right to choose what they do with their bodies, and they should be able to explore their sexuality. Female sexuality shouldn't be stigmatized. And so part of that is, well, hey, what if a woman wants to have a husband, but also sleep with some other guy, either just because she finds it fun and pleasurable or because the other guy offers her something in terms of connections or excitement or social status or whatever. Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's also another movie, early Spike Lee, Join, as he calls it, called She's Gotta Have It, which is, I think it's about that. It's this idea that a woman can have multiple partners because she can and is empowering for her to do so.
Yeah, so you know, do they get treated better in monogamous relationships? Again, you might argue people sometimes feel trapped in monogamous relationships. Now, this norm of monogamy, I think, is extremely noble in some ways, and I think that definitely in traditional Western culture, we're kind of coded to. We want the Hollywood movie to end with a couple kind of going off into the sunset together, with the presumption that they're just always going to be together, and I do find that quite a sweet thing. And like I've known people, like my parents had a beautiful marriage for 50 over 50 years now, and both of my grandparents did too, and that's wonderful to see that they knew each other so well over the course of a lifetime. So yeah, there's lots to like in monogamy too. But yeah, so again, the article was really to explore these different sides of the question.
Mhm. Yes. How would you give a defense to the institution of marriage in today's society?
I think I sort of just was in a sense like I think that ideal is actually a very noble one where you get to know the person deeply, you abide with the person. This is idea of being faithful and loyal. That person's kind of the main thing for you. Um, if you want to get a little bit more social scientific, I'm aware that there's plenty of evidence. I mean, often there's studies that point both ways, but there seems to be plenty of studies that suggest that raising children is better in the sense that children have better outcomes, all other things being equal, in stable monogamous marriages. And you can understand why that is because it's much less complicated. People know where they stand. The kids know who's mommy and who's daddy, and what the situation is going to be next week as well as this week. Things aren't changing so much. People know where their loyalties are. People are devoted to the one partner rather than having to split their attention or split their resources. So, yeah, I mean that Christian ideal, as I say, I think it's noble and it's admirable. That we have to remember that it's weird. It's it's really only been a central part of these Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries, and also the cultures they came from. So Christian cultures, Greco-Roman cultures to a lesser extent. So so yeah, I mean, even though we might find a lot to like about it, obviously most societies and most people in human history have not really been monogamous. Now, there's also a whole debate that I'm not even informed enough on about whether, you know, the human species is pair bonded and what the size of our testicle says about that. And I'm not really prepared to go into that. But, there's also a big argument about whether it's true that we're naturally monogamous or not. But I would just to speak to that as a historian, I'd say that we're obviously not locked into monogamy to the extent that all societies have been monogamous. In fact, as I've just said, it's really only a very small number of societies that have been monogamous, and an extremely small percentage of societies that have been monogamous to the extent that we've taken for granted over the past few generations in the West. That's very, very rare. And Joseph Henrich in his book goes into a few other things about Western family structure, and he says if you look up in the ethnographic atlas, the number of societies which have all three or four of these key things, I can't remember what they are, but one of them is neo-locality, like when you get married, you move to another household, and no cousin marriage, all these different things. If you look at the number of societies which have all these things, it's well under 5% of all the societies listed in the atlas. It's maybe even under 2 or 3%. So yeah, we're talking extremely strange practice, and that's why Scheidell's article, a peculiar institution. It also has a section which is entitled "Defamiliarizing Greco-Roman," or maybe defamiliarizing Western monogamy. So that is actually kind of a healthy thing to do if you want to think about history. Is like if you come to this from a Western or modern perspective, just to be aware, like we take it for granted. It seems really familiar, but it's actually strange. It's actually really bizarre, almost.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and there are plenty of other things that the Western world has originated that, for the non-Western mind, can seem very strange. The idea that people have
Yeah,
rights, for example, I think that it's obviously a Western. homegrown product. So
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts from a Vietnamese perspective, actually, because one of the things that Walter Schaedel says in his article is points out in his article is that the norm of monogamy, like the idea that monogamy is really the only respectable way to go, has spread to the rest of the world really only in the 20th century. So if you look at legal bans on polygamy, which of course tends to be polygyny, they've been very recent in a lot of the world. So I think you can find the exact dates in Scheidel's article, but I think in China it was only after the Second World War that it was formally banned. In India, they banned it, I think, again around independence, but they have this opt out for Muslims. So obviously, in the Muslim world, a certain amount of polygamy is still respectable. But in the rest of the world, even in non-Christian societies or societies which weren't traditionally Christian, you have this kind of catching up thing of, oh, we better be monogamous. We better at least have a legal system that says we're monogamous. And I think that's not so much the influence of Christianity on these societies. That's kind of because the West was so powerful and culturally dominant for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, everybody kind of started thinking, oh, we better do what those guys are doing, right? So the Japanese started adopting Western dress and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's part of this sort of almost sort of cargo cultism that they think, oh, those Western guys are so powerful. We've got to do everything they're doing. Let's say we're monogamous as well.
yeah, again, I should find out more about this, but I would follow, was it Neil Ferguson's his killer apps theory, where he says that the Western civilization has developed these like six killer apps, which makes it more dominant, and then the rest of the world has downloaded these apps and in some ways use them in more effective ways than the Western world. So I would say, monogamous marriage is one of those apps that the rest of the world has caught up on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder how, like, quickly, if you bring in monogamy, to what extent does it start to transform your society? And that, so one of the big questions in my article is also the reverse of that. Like, if you start toying around with polyamory, as we are now in the West, maybe just on the fringes, but among very influential people, how soon do you start seeing ill effects from that? And I don't know the answer to that, and I don't want to be too sort of catastrophizing about it. But we might actually see some genuinely bad effects. But I mean, tell me about Vietnam actually, because I'd be interested. Do you get the sense that growing up, that was very clear in your society that your monogamy was respectable and anything else wasn't? I mean, you said that. I mean, I know in there's no royalty in Vietnam, obviously, but like Thai and Cambodian royalty, I think there's a suggestion that the kings have had pretty public mistresses, right?
Yes, I've
Or
heard.
even second spouses.
I've heard, yes.
Yeah.
I think I remember I only know one person who's been divorced in my upbringing. Everyone has, stayed with their married partners, and the one person who's divorced happens to be a very wealthy man. So the idea of monogamous marriage has always been somewhat linked to economic circumstances because you cannot really afford either a divorce or having another wife, which is a point that I brought up earlier too. In the ancient to feudal world, most people can only have can only afford to have one wife. They're not kings or warlords or anything.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I get the sense that that norm is pretty much sort of spread around the world, with the exception of what people call the polygamy, the polygamy belt, which is basically um, North Africa. Um, there's still polygamy practiced both by Muslims and animists, but and maybe there's some rare exceptions in Mormon in like Utah, some Mormon communities. What else? And then, of course, you got this phenomenon I'm talking about, which is kind of like, rich, well-educated people in the West with dating apps. So completely different thing, but yeah.
I'd like to end with this. So, do you believe that the what we take for granted in Western societies, the gifts, the fruits, liberal democracy, equality between the sexes, and individual rights, um, would would all of those, in order to maintain those gifts, do we have to also maintain a culturally enforced monogamy?
That's the big question, man. I don't know what the answer is really, but I will say that, if you read Henrik's book, I mean, it's really a magnificent new theory of how Western civilization developed, and there's a lot of support for it. He's drawing on lots of other people's empirical work, and if you buy that story, then like a lot of the Western package of liberalism and individualism and democracy and human rights, even things like science, come partly out of Western family structure. And that may seem like a tall order, like a ambitious argument. But the way he suggests it happens is basically that in most human societies, the sort of clan is very important. Your kinship networks are extremely important. And that means that you tend to kind of do things on behalf of your kin. You associate less with non-kin. And that makes things like the market economy just a little bit more difficult to develop, even things like democracy. In the West, what you get is this very, very strict redefinition of the family, so that basically you can't have these big marriage networks because you can't marry your cousin, you can't even marry your second cousin, you can only have one wife, you can only sleep with one woman, etc. And so what that helps to motivate is these civil associations. So people have to look outside the family for community. And, of course, there are Buddhist monasteries too, but there's the spread of monasticism in the West, there's universities, there's guilds and trade unions, and all these things are part of what makes the West relatively powerful once you get into the modern period. So, one of the big questions I'm interested in now is, given that that's the way the West developed and became so influential, what parts of that package can we get rid of if we wanted to without destroying the whole, the fruits of that whole process? And I mean, I suspect, as I say in the article, that we probably can get rid of some of those things, right? Because just because the West happened to have walked this path, it doesn't mean that all those things are absolutely essential for liberalism and democracy. So the example I give in the article is literacy. So literacy in the 19th century, or even after the Reformation, basically, there's plenty of good empirical work on this where they look at like different counties in Prussia and I think in Switzerland as well. And historically, I mean, because they have some data from the 19th century. And Protestant counties are much more literate than Catholic ones. So there's quite a strong association between Protestantism and literacy historically, probably because of this emphasis on sola scriptura, scripture alone as a guide to salvation. So Protestants have this edge in literacy for many years, and then once you get into the very modern periods of the 20th century, other people around the world start, well, maybe even before that, they start thinking, actually, literacy is very useful. We're not Protestants, but we're going to learn literacy because I've seen these other guys become so powerful and well educated with literacy. So we're going to teach our children to read. And of course, now you have a situation where, PISA scores, international comparisons suggest that things like mathematics and English, and well, not English, but writing, learning how to read and write. East Asian countries actually outperform the West in terms of instructing their youth in these things. So it could be that a lot of things are like that. It could be that we could let go of the things that led to those benefits and still retain them. So we could say like, let's just all be polyamorous, or like, let's drop the strict norms around marriage, and let's just keep being democratic and keep being liberal and keep having a market economy because we like those things. It all sort of depends on how close the association is and what the mechanism is. I am quite worried about. If there's one thing I would worry about with monogamy becoming less of a thing. It's not really so much for me that democracy is going to collapse, to be honest, or liberalism is going to collapse. It's inequality, because I think it's going to be associated, like as inequality increases again, because inequality was historically low in the West after the Second World War until about the 70s and 80s. As inequality increases again, we're probably going to have a world where, well, we already do, of course, especially in the States. Some few people are extremely wealthy and a lot of people aren't so wealthy. And if you relax the norm of monogamy as well, I mean, even in the best of times or the strictest of times, when the official norm was like Elon Musk can only have one wife, one after the other, elite men would still get away with having multiple partners and stuff, right? They found ways of doing it. But I think that if we relax the norm further, I would worry about, really, we're going to go back maybe to one of these situations where the elite men just have a lot of wives and mistresses and all the rest, and the guys further down the pecking order really get nothing at all. And then if you're kind of a techno utopian, you think, well, there's porn. And people are going to be sated by that. There's going to be these sex bots or sex robots and all the rest. But I think that most people who are human beings suspect that you're a person than you do from a screen, including actually the ability to form families and children, and that these are precious things, and that if there does become, if a proletariat does sort of develop a male proletariat without access to actual human partners, that's going to be a big challenge for stability in our societies.
All right. Well, on that rather sobering note, I'd like to end the program and thank James Kierstead of New Zealand Initiative for joining the program.
Thanks a lot, John.